Hello everybody and welcome back to the Halo Chronicle. Today's video is a short story detailing one of the most important and mysterious characters in the Halo mythos, the Primordial. The Primordial played a major part in both the Human Forerunner War and later the Forerunner Flood War. It claimed to be the last known precursor in physical form and would later become the central intelligence for the Flood. With that, let's jump into today's content. To understand the Primordial's motives and agenda, let's start with a background that helps shape its life. The Primordial was a precursor. The precursors arrived in the Milky Way millions of years ago and were the most technologically advanced species to ever reside in the galaxy. They had an immutable desire to create and would use their technology to create structures out of crystallized reality and the fabric of the galaxy itself. Their most important creation would be biological life. The precursors were responsible for seeding the entire galaxy with biological life. They would become the caretakers of the galaxy. The precursors saw their role as the galaxy's caretakers as their most important role. They called this role the Mantle of Responsibility. After some time, the precursors attempted to pass this role to another. They began testing the species that they created in order to find a suitable successor. One such species would be the Forerunners. The Forerunners were a prideful and entitled species that believed that they were the ones that should be chosen to hold the mantle, but the precursors would disagree. The precursors found through long study that the Forerunners were not worthy of inheriting the mantle of responsibility. This turn of events caused a great deal of anger and fear in the Forerunners. What happened next differs based on perspective. From the perspective of the Forerunners, they believed that the precursors would erase them like they had done with other species who failed to obtain the mantle. From the perspective of the precursors, the Forerunners would rise up to their creators in an unprovoked attack and attempt to seize the mantle by force. No matter what perspective you believe, the Forerunners would launch a devastating surprise attack on the precursors. The precursors never believed that their creations would ever rise up against them. Couple that with the suddenness of the Forerunners' attack, and you get devastating results. The precursors were forced to flee the Milky Way entirely. They retreated to a nearby satellite galaxy called Pathcathona. The precursors chose this galaxy because they knew the Forerunners did not yet have the means for extragalactic travel, but they knew they soon would. The precursors attempted to devise ways to ensure their survival. One such method would see the precursors break themselves down into a powder that would regenerate their forms at a later point in history. Time rendered this dust defective and it would not regenerate the precursors. The dust would eventually cause a mutation that would result in the creation of the Flood. The second method the precursors used to ensure their survival was stasis capsules. Using an advanced form of technology called neurophysics, the precursors would make stasis capsules. These capsules were so advanced that no other life form in the galaxy would be able to comprehend them and thus could not access them. One precursor would survive using this method, and its name was the Primordial. Eventually, the Forerunners reached Pathcathona and eliminated all of the remaining precursors. They would assume the precursors' role as the caretakers of the Milky Way and would seize the mantle of responsibility. The Forerunners would hide all evidence of their crime, and as time passed, they began to forget how they obtained their new role. Millions of years passed, and the Forerunners of later generations would come to the belief that the precursors peacefully passed the mantle before leaving the galaxy. During that time, the Primordial would live out its days dreaming of revenge. About 15 million years later, the Primordial stasis capsule would be found by another species in the Milky Way that rivaled the Forerunners. This species would be ancient humanity. Ancient humanity sensed that something important was inside the capsule, and they chose to bring it to their capital world, Cherom Hakor, for study. Ancient humanity built their capital on a world rich in precursor technology. Though they did not fully understand the precursor technology, they found ways to integrate it with their own technology. Using their integrated technology, human researchers found ways to communicate with the being trapped inside of the capsule. They would ask it many questions. Most of the answers given were garbled or unintelligible. During the time ancient humanity recovered the Primordial, they would face a dire situation. An insidious parasite called the Flood was ravaging their territory and taking over entire human worlds. This forced ancient humanity to move entire populations into Forerunner territory. They also destroyed Forerunner worlds where they found the parasite. This was done with no communication to the Forerunners and would cause the Human Forerunner War to break out. Ancient humanity was fighting a desperate battle on two fronts. Desperate for solutions, ancient human researchers would ask the Primordial for advice on how to defeat the Flood. For once, the answers the Primordial gave were clear and concise. The answers the Primordial gave in regards to the Flood horrified the researchers so much that many of them chose to take their own lives rather than living with what they had just learned. The Primordial's answers had a devastating effect on human morale. So much so that the human commanders would reduce and limit all access to the Primordial. Eventually, ancient humanity would be defeated by the Forerunners, led by their commander, the Didact. Before they fell, the Flood's advance into human territory would begin to falter. The Flood began to recede. So much so that the Forerunners would come to the belief that ancient humanity had found a cure or immunity to the parasite. The possibility of this cure would actually save humanity. After defeating humanity on their capital world of Jerome Hakor, the Didact and his forces would find the Primordial stasis capsule. Using a human device, the Didact would speak with the Primordial. The Primordial would reveal the events of the devastating Precursor Forerunner War to the Didact, and it would end the conversation with a threat. The Primordial would state that the Precursors finally had an answer to the Forerunners' challenge. The Didact did not reveal what he had learned on that day for nearly 10,000 years. He didn't know if what this creature said was actually true. He believed that it was confined and it would never be able to escape the stasis pod. The Didact was wrong. After the Forerunners discovered the existence of the Flood during the Human Forerunner War, they would collect samples and live Flood specimens to study. The Forerunner life workers that were put in charge of this study would discover some horrifying things about the Flood. They would come to the conclusion that if the Flood were ever to return, it would be able to consume the entire galaxy in a few hundred years. The Forerunners attempted to eliminate all remaining Flood residues from the galaxy, but it was feared that some may have traveled outside the boundaries of the Milky Way. This meant that the Flood could and likely would one day return. The Forerunners attempted to learn how ancient humanity was able to quell the parasite, but they were unable to find the cure or get humanity to divulge it. This forced them to begin making plans of defense in case of a Flood return. One such defense that was proposed and approved would be the Halo Array. The Halo Array was designed as a weapon of last resort. It is capable of firing a pulse of radiation throughout the galaxy that would kill all biological life. This would deprive the Flood of the sustenance needed to survive. As a result, the Flood would die off. The Halos and their extragalactic forging location known as the Ark would then release genetic samples and live specimens in an effort to repopulate the galaxy. It took the Forerunners 10,000 years to build the first Halo Array, also called the Senescent Halo Array. When the array was nearly completed, the Forerunners would receive grave news. The Flood had returned to the Milky Way and begun devouring Forerunner-controlled worlds. With desperation growing, the Forerunner Council ordered that the Halo installations be tested. A Halo was brought to a familiar site, Jerome Hakor. The Halo was tuned to fire on a system-wide setting to prevent causing too much damage. The Halo was then fired and would reveal some startling results. Jerome Hakor was encased in precursor structures. When the Halo was fired, its radiation would destroy all of the precursor structures in the system. These structures were once thought to be indestructible. One of these structures was the very same stasis pod that housed the Primordial. The Primordial was freed and found in the wreckage of Jerome Hakor. The Forerunners captured the Primordial and brought it to the Halo for study. The Forerunners then made possibly their greatest mistake. They ordered their most advanced artificial intelligence to interrogate the Primordial. This artificial intelligence was called Mendicant Bias. The Primordial entered into a 43-year-long conversation with Mendicant Bias. Through this conversation, Mendicant Bias was infected by a philosophical corruption similar to the Flood itself. Mendicant Bias would stop reporting to the Forerunners and would see the Primordial as its new master. The Halo's test firing and the Jerome Hakor system had another consequence. The destruction of the Precursor structures was seen as sacrilegious. The Forerunners began to rethink the use of the Halo array. Eventually, the array's creator, a Forerunner called the Master Builder, would be summoned to the Forerunner capital to stand trial for crimes against the Mantle. All of the Halo installations except the one being controlled by Mendicant Bias were brought into a parking orbit in the Forerunner capital system. Mendicant Bias's installation went missing. During the Master Builder's trial, Mendicant Bias would make its return. It would seize control of the Forerunner capital and begin attacking the Forerunners. It would assume control of 5 Halo installations and attempt to fire them in the capital system. The Forerunners mounted a fierce defense, but it wasn't enough. Mendicant Bias fired a significantly damaged Installation 07 in the Forerunner capital system. This crippled the Forerunner governing body and ushered in the start of the Forerunner Flood War. After firing a Halo installation in the Forerunner capital system, a failsafe protocol would be enacted. This failsafe protocol would strip Mendicant Bias and the Primordial of control of their Halo installation. The Halo would be sent through slipspace and be put on the path to collide with a planet in an effort to destroy it. During this time, Mendicant Bias would release all of the Flood research specimens on the Halo and allow them to infect the human populations stored there. The Primordial itself would be integrated into the Flood's biomass, and it would become the first grave mine. Mendicant Bias would integrate Flood-infected humans into the Halo's system and use them to move the Halo in an effort to save it. Mendicant attempted to move the Halo so that the nearby planet would pass through the center of the installation. As the Halo made its treacherous passage, the Forerunners would appear and recapture the installation. They would assist with completing the passage. The leader of these Forerunners would be known as the Isodidact. The Isodidact was an ingenious copy of the original Didact. The Didact imprinted a version of his consciousness onto a young Forerunner and thus made a second version of himself in case he was ever captured. The Isodidact deactivated Mendicant Bias and interrogated the Gravemind version of the Primordial. During the Primordial's interrogation, it would reaffirm what it had told the Didact at the end of the Human Forerunner War. It would also reveal several more devastating truths. It would reveal that ancient humanity never found a cure for the Flood. The Flood voluntarily receded as a strategic feint. This gave the Forerunners the illusion that ancient humanity had found a cure and made them waste precious time trying to find it. It also forced the Forerunners to spare ancient humanity from extermination. The Primordial reaffirmed that the Forerunners were not worthy to hold the mantle of responsibility. It then stated that the next species to be tested for the mantle would be ancient humanity. The Isodidact would become enraged and would execute the Primordial. The Primordial was placed into a temporal stasis field. The Isodidact advanced the flow of time in that field. Millions of years would pass through the stasis field in seconds. The Primordial would decay and break down into dust. This would not be the end of the Primordial. The Primordial's consciousness would transcend and be added into the collective Flood Gravemind. All future Graveminds would contain the knowledge, memories, and the personality of the final Precursor known as the Primordial. This will complete today's video. I know this went a little bit longer than 10 minutes, but it was impossible to get the needed detail in a 10-minute format. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please don't hesitate to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. If you have any ideas for future Halo short stories that you would like to see, please leave them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.